part 1 of this video, we saw how we could use selections to make adjustments to brightness and to the color balance in our images. Now in this part 2, we'll look at the other 3 things that we do to our images. Now moving on to our third adjustment that we make to our images, and that is, does the image or part of the image need more or less contrast? Now here is the image, or an image I took of Kirkafell in Iceland, and this is the image as opened from the camera, no adjustments at all. You can see that it's a pretty flat day, a lot of overcast, some fairly deep shadows, and not a great looking image. Well, the most important thing to do initially is to make some adjustments in Lightroom with the raw data, and here's the image after I'd made a number of adjustments in Lightroom. And of course what we're looking at is not only exposure, but we're looking at adding contrast using the contrast slider. But bear in mind also that as you start to move the sliders for highlights, shadows, whites and blacks around, you will increase or decrease the contrast as well. So it's important to use all of these tools together. So let's just go back to the original image, and you can see there that if I increase the exposure, you'll see that the original capture preserved the highlights, but I've got a little bit, not much, blacked up in the shadows. So we'd be looking at doing things like lightening up the shadows, but of course as we increase the shadows we also lose more contrast. So if you're opening up the shadows, you need to then also bring back some contrast and maybe adjust the blacks as well. So it's a little bit of a juggling act to make sure that you keep this all within what's appropriate. And going back to what I did here, you'll see here that I pushed the shadows pretty much all the way up. I've pulled the whites and the highlights down a bit to protect those parts of the sky, and I've also moved up the blacks considerably because I wanted to bring out some detail in here. And so all of this is adding to the contrast from the original image. If I go back and reset that, you'll see that that was pretty dark. I've done most of my major work in bringing out those adjustments in Lightroom before we took it into Photoshop. So let's go and have a look at that in Photoshop. Now here's the image as opened in Photoshop, and I've done a number of things. I've actually taken some of the water moving from another exposure where I used a faster shutter speed because I like the idea of blending 2 different shutter speeds together. You'll see here that this was a slow shutter speed, blurred the water quite considerably, and I took another exposure from the same spot using a faster shutter speed, and I've just blended the 2 together. And that's a little trick I like to apply. I also picked out, there were a couple of people caught here in the image, and in the second exposure they'd moved on. So I blended those 2 together, and then I did a little bit of cloning out. Unfortunately this location is right on a main road, and with farms and things I had to then remove all of those messy things and brought it back. So moving on to increasing the contrast using a Silver Effects Pro, which is a monochrome adjustment layer, but blending that to luminosity, I'm bringing up more contrast and more detail. But you'll see that overall we've got to add a lot more contrast to the image to bring out different aspects, and all of these are made using various selections. I've made a selection of the sky and then by hand painted out some of the other areas that I didn't want affected. And so we progressively build up our image and finally add more contrast. You'll see that there's a lot of work gone into this image, and one of the most important tools in finally adjusting the tonal range of the image is to use our very handy inverse overlay adjustment, which brings back some of the remapping of the tones in the image. So let's have a look at how we did that. So one of the last things we can do to add contrast into the image is to add the inverse overlay layer. But there's another filter that also adds to the contrast, and it adds color contrast, and that's using one of the Nik Color Effects Pro layers. And to do this you obviously need to have Nik installed, but if we go into Color Effects Pro And the filter I like to use is called Tonal Contrast, and in the Nik Color Effects Pro library there are lots and lots of filters, but the one I'm using here is Tonal Contrast, and here it is applied to the image. And on the left hand side is the before version, and the right hand side is the after version. So you can see that it is reasonably subtle, but it does add a bit of color contrast. But it also adds a little bit more contrast in the sky, and I'm not really sure that I want that. It's already pretty contrasty. I think that that's getting a bit too much. But rather than apply a mask in Photoshop, we can do this from within the Nik software. And if you're not familiar with the Nik software, there are a lot of videos available that demonstrate the features. But basically what I'm going to do is add what's called a control point, which uses an automatic mask selection to determine where the filter is applied. Now I'm going to add a minus control point, which means it's going to have zero effect of the filter, and I have two little sliders here. One is determining the size of the range of this control point, and the second one controls the amount of the filter that's being applied. Now I want zero effect, and you can see there where it's taken it out of the sky. Now I could just expand that area to cover the whole of the sky, but it's going to then start to include some of the other areas. So the easy way to expand this to cover all of the sky is to use our Alt key and click on this little circle and then duplicate, click and drag, and you are now duplicating the effect of this filter, and so it's now taking the effect out of the sky. And I think I probably need a couple of more points up here. And if I now go to my control points, click on this downward arrow, these are all the control points I've added. If I click on this little tool to show the mask, you'll see that now I'm masking out most of the area, and I need to add a couple more points up there to take it out of the sky. Now looking at this mask, I can also see that it's picked up some of the area of water. So if I turn that mask tool off again and go back in and add a control point with 100% opacity, I can then click on these points and bring that effect back into those points where it's been removed. And let's just go back in and look at our masking now. Yes, we can see now that the effect has been brought back in over all those important areas and taken out of the sky. So let's turn that mask back off and let's have a look at the preview. So on the left now is the before, and we now have the after. It's quite a subtle effect, but it does boost the color contrast in these areas. And to add to this, I'm going to add another filter on top of the one that I've already applied, and this time I'm going to add what's called the Pro Contrast, because we're talking about contrast in this image. And if we apply what's called a neutral Pro Contrast filter, you'll see that in fact it has no effect as it stands. We need to then move these sliders. Now it has three sliders. The first one corrects any color cast in the image, and you'll see if I slide that right across, it moves it more into the blues. I don't really want much of that, maybe just a slight amount of color correction. The contrast slider I find is much too harsh, and I tend not to use that, but the dynamic contrast uses a little bit more subtle control and just builds up the contrast a little bit further in the image. So with those selected, we click OK and return to Photoshop and see how the effect looks. And so now we have the effect applied to the whole of the image with that control point selection not affecting the sky. So if we turn that off and on, you'll see there is still a little bit of effect there, and maybe it is just a little bit too much overall. So again, we can just reduce the opacity of that layer until we've got what we want. And the final treatment we're going to use is the inverse overlay treatment, and I'll step through this one piece at a time. The first thing we need to do is make a new composite layer of everything below. So to do that, we use the keyboard shortcut Control Shift Alt and E, and that will create a new layer above everything else. And now we work on this layer. First thing we do is we go to the image adjustment tool image adjustments, and the first thing we do is to totally desaturate, because we're looking at the tonal values that we're going to remap. So having desaturated, the next thing we do is we go back to the image menu, adjustments, and invert, so that we now have a negative version of our image. And I'll just get rid of that nick menu so it's not interfering. So with that in place, we now go to the filters menu and we go to the blur menu, Gaussian blur, and typically you'd be looking at something in the order of 250 pixels. It gives you a very soft blurred effect. Click OK, and we now have the blur applied to the image. And the last thing we do is we turn on the overlay blend mode so that we remap the tones. Now often it's way too severe at full strength, so again we can reduce the opacity till we get the effect that we're looking for. It's just a slight remapping of the tones and the contrast within the image. And again, if you want to exclude this from part of the image, we can simply add a layer mask to this and paint on. So there's no need to make further selections in applying this filter. So the fourth thing that we can do to our images is to make them either more or less colourful, either over the whole image or in selected areas. Now here's an image of some kelp washed up on a beach in Western Tasmania, and as you can see, the initial image is fairly flat. There's not a lot of colour in it, but I wanted to make this much more colourful. And with some adjustments in Lightroom, this is what I made of it. And it's important to do most of these early adjustments with the raw data in Lightroom. So how did we do this? Let's have a look. Going back to the base image, you'll see that in the basic panel, nothing has been changed. No adjustments, but looking at the adjusted raw file, I've made some tonal adjustments to increase contrast, but also added texture and clarity and a fair amount of vibrance. But that's not the whole story. If we come down to the HSL panel, you can see here we have a tool to adjust the saturation as well as the hue and the luminance. We're not going to touch either of those. We're just going to play with the saturation, and we can use the targeted adjustment tool to pick out the areas in the image that we want to address, such as this area. You can see it's largely made up of orange and yellow as I move the slider up and down, or if I go across to this area here, it's mainly the magentas and purples that I'm picking up with. So by just clicking and dragging on the image with the areas that you want to change, you don't need to make any selections whatsoever, and you can target the colors you want to change. So now we'll move into Photoshop and see how we can manipulate colors further using filters and layers in Photoshop. So here's the image opened in Photoshop, and as you can see, I've done most of the work already in Lightroom using the targeted adjustment tool. But we can do a similar thing in Photoshop using a HSL adjustment layer. And if I turn this layer on, I've just marginally increased saturation again. And in the Photoshop HSL adjustment layer, we have a similar tool to the targeted adjustment tool. The little hand slider allows us to pick and slide colors and adjust them further. Now, once we get into Photoshop, these adjustments become a little bit more magnified, so you need to be a bit more subtle with how you treat those. But again, we can pick the individual colors and manipulate them. So there is no need at all for any selection when we're picking out selective color and saturation increases. Now, one other thing to remember is when we move into doing adjustments in Photoshop is if we add a curves adjustment layer, and as we start to darken parts of the image, what happens is the image becomes more saturated as we darken it down. And if I turn the layer on, it would be much more obvious. Let's just reset that as the default setting. You'll see now that there is no effect on color or tonality with it set in the default area. But if I darken this image down, not only does the image get darker, but these colors become much more saturated. So one thing to be aware of when you're doing curves adjustments in Photoshop or any image editing software, once you start changing the tonal range fairly dramatically, you will increase not only the contrast, but you'll change the saturation. So in Photoshop, as in Lightroom, you don't even need to make a selection to adjust saturation in a particular part of the image, unless of course that one particular part of the image has the same colors as the rest of the image, and in that case you can simply do it by painting on the mask. Now, the last of our 5 things that we can do to our images is to make them either sharper or duller, and that means applying sharpening to the image. And the important thing to remember here is that objects that appear sharper or more well defined in an image appear to be closer to the viewer, and things that are softer appear to be further away. So let's have a look at the effect of sharpening on an image. Here is an image of a puffin taken in Iceland, and you can see here that at the moment it's at the default settings as opened from Lightroom or from the raw file. And you'll see here that it was shot at 5600 ISO, quite high ISO setting, and of course is a little bit noisy and a little bit soft. But by applying sharpening in Lightroom to the image, we can see that we've actually improved it somewhat, and we've also used some noise reduction. So let's just go back and look at the image before. Quite noisy, quite soft. And after Lightroom adjustments, a little less noisy and a little more sharp. And then the final image is the version that we've created in Photoshop, is a lot sharper, a lot more clearly defined, and a much better image. So let's just go back and see how we apply this sharpening. Here's the original one again, and this time in Lightroom we've applied some sharpening, and we've increased the detail dramatically, but we've used the masking slider within Lightroom. Now, to see how this affects our image, if we hold down the Alt key and move the slider, you'll see that we've actually restricted the sharpening to just the edges. We don't need to sharpen areas of continuous tone, we only need to look at the edges. So if I release the Alt key, we can see the effect. And if I zoom back out to the full image and do the same thing, hold down Alt and select the masking slider, you'll see that we're only really applying sharpening to the edges. And likewise, we're applying luminance reduction to the noise over the whole image, but we'll move on and refine this a little further in Photoshop. So here we have our puffin image opened in Photoshop, and the first thing I would do with this is to use the Topaz plugins for denoise and sharpen AI, and just seeing the difference. Let's just zoom this in to 100%. And you can see the remarkable difference this piece of software makes to an image. It's removed all of that residual noise and applied quite a reasonable amount of sharpening without overdoing it to the image. So applying sharpening to the effective parts of the image, it's not going to sharpen the bits that are out of focus, so we don't have to worry about those. So by adding things like a Nik filter to bring out some more contrast and some Color Effects Pro, we can bring things back, but here we're just looking at the sharpening effect. So let's just move on up and look at what we're going to do to bring out the contrast. Now, the last thing that we want to do with our image is to enhance the localized contrast, and we can do that by doing what's called a selective sharpening layer. And to do that, ignoring all the other adjustments I've made to the image, I think that one I don't need. Yes, we've come up with the image that looks pretty good at this point, but I now want to selectively sharpen the bird and not the background, and we can do that with what's called a 25-25-0 layer, which is an unsharp mask. So I've already done that, but let's just redo it. So firstly, we make a composite layer. Control-Alt-Shift-E, doesn't matter which order you press them in as long as you press them all at once, and we make a new composite layer. And now to apply that sharpening, we go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and here are the settings. 25, amount of 25, which is a low amount of sharpening, but we use a very large radius, and normally the threshold would be 0 or 1. It's just to determine what number of differences in tone the software needs to consider before it applies this sharpening. So let's just do that and apply that sharpening, and it takes 1 or 2 seconds to apply. Let's just zoom in again to 100% and see the difference. And here's the difference. This is without the extra sharpening, and here it is with the sharpening. Now the problem is, of course, that as we look at it now, we've applied this to the whole image, and what we want to do is we want to just apply it to the bird. So here's where we need to make a selection. Now the easiest way to make a selection here would be to use the object selection tool, and it works pretty well here because the bird is quite well defined. And as you can see, I've just hovered over the bird and it's selected it out perfectly. I'll just click on that to make a selection, and now we have a selection active. And with that selection active, they're the bits that we want to apply the mask to. With that selection active and on this sharpening layer, we just add a layer mask, and we now have a very fine selection. Now because we're just applying sharpening with this, and I'll just get rid of that tool so it doesn't keep trying to select things, with that very tightly refined selection, it doesn't really matter because we're just applying that sharpening to those areas, and it's not really going to bleed into the other areas. So that's one way we can apply that selective sharpening to our image to really bring out that fine detail. But there are other points where you might decide that you want to do something a little bit different. And here, for instance, another image from Iceland. We have a landscape image and we have a strong foreground and leading off into the distance. And again, if we go back to the original image, I've made a number of adjustments to tonality and saturation and so forth, and it's got it to this point. But again, I want to make this extra sharpening layer, and so we do the same thing. We Control Alt Shift and E, new composite layer, filter, sharpen, unsharp mask, 25, 25 and 1 or 0, and we now have this extra level of sharpening. Now again, we need to zoom in to either 50 or 100% to see the effect, and you can see here this is with the extra sharpening layer and without. It's a little bit subtle because it's more mid-tone contrast that it's adding, but you can see that it's made a difference. But we don't want it in the rest of the background, so quite simply again we would just need to make a selection, and using our quick selection tool we can probably make a selection of the foreground area fairly simply. Again, it doesn't need to be super refined, it just needs to encompass all of the areas that we want to add the sharpening to. And by just drawing our brush around here, in fact I might need to make that brush a little bit bigger. The larger the brush size with your quick selection tool, the larger the tonal range that it's considering. So we can pretty much paint on here without too much trouble, and it's going to bring in all of those areas that we want to include. Once we have all of those selected, and with that in hand, we can now apply that as a mask. Now it's still got to finish selecting a couple of these areas, but again fairly simply, and again we don't need to refine this terribly well because it's picked up the edges fairly nicely with the foreground selected, and on our sharpening layer simply apply that selection as a mask, and there we are. And look, I've missed a couple of places. Well, that's easily fixed. Paintbrush tool, use the X key to change from black to white, and in this case I really want to just paint that in, so 100% opacity. I paint that in, and now Alt click on that again, and we now have our sharpening layer applied and selectively applied to the image. So there we go. And one last quick example showing how we can apply sharpening selectively. Here's an image, the raw file as captured without any sharpening applied, captured at Sydney's Taronga Zoo, and after applying some adjustments in Lightroom, including tonal adjustments and so forth. We've added some sharpening and added some noise reduction. It was shot at moderate ISO of 2200, so a little bit of moderate noise reduction, and of course sharpening selectively applied to the image and masked out, so we're only picking up the edges. Now with that image taken into Photoshop, we can see again how the effectiveness of selective sharpening is applied. And here's our image as brought in. Let's just fit the screen, and here's the effect of the topaz noise reduction. Let's just zoom in even tighter, 50%. You can see that it's really brought out the fine details in the folds of the skin and the hairs on the chimp's face. Remarkable piece of software. So adding selective adjustments, and I decided at this point that rather than leave it as a color image, it was going to work better as a monochrome image because all this green in the background was distracting. I used a Nik Silver Effects Pro adjustment and blended it to normal, and so I've got a lovely monochrome image. But then applying some tonal adjustments using a selection based on the chimp itself, and to make that selection I used the object selection tool and then refined it and gradually brought the tonal changes up. And then we can, even if we wanted to, we could come in and apply that selective sharpening to this at the end. But I think in this case we've already applied the sharpening and it works really well. I don't think we need any more sharpening. And of course the sharpening isn't going to apply to the out of focus areas because there's nothing to sharpen. And I think selective sharpening as applied where it's needed is a very effective tool in your image making. So we've learned a couple of things by looking at the 5 things that we do to our images and looking at the types of selections we make. It's easy to get carried away with really spending a lot of time making very refined selections and worrying about which tool to use. But in fact, with a lot of the adjustments we make both in Lightroom and Photoshop, we don't need to make particularly refined selections. It's only for some of the adjustments. A lot of the treatments we can apply to our images can be done within the tools that exist already in Photoshop and Lightroom. So we can use these tools to make an average image into an outstanding image as long as we understand what we're doing with the image and use the appropriate tools to make those changes. I hope that's been helpful. I look forward to seeing you again soon.